That is Break Even. Whew, I love that one. That's by the Script Savage. That's going out to you. I hope you liked it. Hi.
You don't know how sweet I am. You don't know how sweet I am. I am what I am, and I am sweet. You don't know how sweet I am.
Yo, check this. I might not be what you want me to be, so you might not see what you want to see. But if you got a minute, listen to what I gotta say. Cause it's a brand new year, and it's a brand new day. See, there's a gap between my culture and the life that I lead. So some will call me an apple, and some a bad seed. They have no idea how my heart will bleed. Their words and attitudes are things I just don't need.
You don't know how sweet I am. I am what I am, and I am sweet.
You see, I'm proud of who I am, and I'm proud of where I'm from. Those ones spreading racism, they're just fucking dumb. Now if you're looking at my life, and you say I've assimilated, you simplify things, just a little more complicated. See, I'm a modern day native, with a modern day life. I have modern day problems, and modern day strife. Now I hear other natives, they talk about the past, and will I do the same? Fuck that. See, I've got no time to dwell on what's already done. I've got too many things that I want to do. And they don't include knives, and they don't include guns. I'm talking about knowledge and sharing it too. See, my people need to learn how to cohabitate, get rid of the anger, and get rid of the hate. We gotta stop for a minute and learn to educate. And you'll see in the end, we all have to communicate. I know there'll be a time to make a stand and a time to fight, but if you do that, make sure the cause is right. Because if the cause is right and the cause is just, greater numbers of people will be backing you up. History has repeatedly shown to us all that united we stand and divided we fall. They were talking about natives and natives alone, because this is a big world and this world is our home. Now I've seen some beautiful people and ugly ones too, and there's no single color that comes into view. So the message I'm sending, it's not all that long. It's just, I want the human race to be stronger than strong. I said I just want the human race to be stronger than strong.
We all have to be strong.
Done it. Word.
We all have to be strong. Peace.
Gangakwa zawadahan sios ona angadaswa o handagali wadakwa. Ungwet su'a gwegwaska jedadawa pet nuni ni gwat nigula dana de tinu haladas na gwet su'a tinidohak ni gwat nigula. Agwegwaska jedadawa pet nuni ni gwat nigula dana de tinu haladas ni ikini ista ohun jage tinidohak ni gwat nigula. Agwegwaska jedadawa pet nuni ni gwat nigula dana de tinu haladas na ohun de su'a tinidohak ni gwat nigula. Agwegwaska jedadawa pet nuni ni gwat nigula dana de tinu haladas na ohun kwat su'a tinidohak ni gwat nigula. Agwegwaska jedadawa pet nuni ni gwat nigula dana de tinu haladas na ohun gat su'a tinidohak ni gwat nigula. Agwagwaska jin the dawa wet nuni guat nigula than a detinu halado snare gahi sua. Tinidohak ni guat nigula. Agwagwaska jin the dawa wet nuni guat nigula than a detinu halado snare gain tosla. Tinidohak ni guat nigula. Agwagwaska jin the dawa wet nuni guat nigula than a detinu halado snare gojo sua. Tinidohak ni guat nigula. Agwagwaska jin the dawa wet nuni guat nigula than a detinu halado snare gondilio. Tinidohak ni guat nigula. Agwagwaska jin the dawa wet nuni guat nigula than a detinu halado snare ogwila sua. Tinidohak ni guat nigula. Agwagwaska jin the dawa wet nuni guat nigula than a detinu halado snare ojido angoa. Tinidohak ni guat nigula. Agwagwaska jin the dawa wet nuni guat nigula than a detinu halado snare itisatugo on la diwalas. Tinidohak ni guat nigula. Agwagwaska jin the dawa wet nuni guat nigula than a detinu halado snare gali ni gawalage. Tinidohak ni guat nigula. Agwagwaska jin the dawa wet nuni guat nigula than a detinu halado snare sugwat jia gilkena galakwa. Tinidohak ni guat nigula. Agwagwaska jin the dawa wet nuni guat nigula than a detinu halado snare itisata santana galakwa. Tinidohak ni guat nigula. Agwagwaska jin the dawa wet nuni guat nigula than a detinu halado snare ojisto kwa sua. Tinidohak ni guat nigula. Agwagwaska jin the dawa wet nuni guat nigula than a detinu halado snare gali ni agwedige. Tinidohak ni guat nigula. Agwagwaska jin the dawa wet nuni guat nigula than a dachidinu halado snare sungwai diza. Tinidohak ni guat nigula. Ona wa galiwa hodungo no wani dizlada dogat tena zike nigoha nisigi aizoda sundala aizawasa. Tinidohak ni guat nigula.
Sgully swagwag, Galahindi Neo Gets, Wagishli Wagi, Niwak Toloda, Unida Unege, Ani, Ozro, Danse, Okinapi, How, in Yonko, Yukotonlos. So for those of you who have just arrived or don't know what I just said or are here for the first time, I always introduce myself in my original language. So I said, Sgoli Swagwag, or hello everyone. Galahindi is my name, translates to clouds passing over in the colonial language. I'm a member of the people of the Standing Stone First Nations here on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Delaware, and Huron nations in an area that we call the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Territory or Covenant Treaty Territory. So I am just signing into our Zoom. As you know, we're going to be jumping in on a Zoom meeting and sharing a discussion on Palestine today. What I wanted to do real quickly while we're waiting for this is I'm going to show you a real brief history on the Israel-Palestine conflict and uh, how that's kind of processed. So I'm going to get my mug off the screen here. Maybe I would do it this way. I will go here. Yeah. Try this.
This is a map of Palestine in 1946, and this is Palestine in 2023. The drastic change involved the killing of thousands of Palestinians, with millions of others being displaced over the course of over 7 decades. Here are the historical events that led to the shrinking of Palestinian lands and the foundation and the expansion of the State of Israel. Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire in the 1900s, and Muslims, Christians, and Jews had been living alongside each other in harmony. On the European continent, however, the Zionist movement is introduced by Theodor Herzl in 1896. It aims to create an independent Jewish state in the Middle East, ideally on Palestinian land. The movement begins to take hold as the first wave of European Jews start to migrate to Palestine. By the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapses and Palestine falls under British rule. In 1917, Britain announces its support for a Jewish state in Palestine in what is known as the Balfour Declaration. The number of Jewish settlers in Palestine grows, fueling tensions between Arabs and Jews in the region. Violence begins to break out between the two sides. In February 1947, the UK offers to relinquish its mandatory role and places the question of Palestine before the UN. In November the same year, the UN approves of a plan to split Palestine into 2 states, Jewish Israel and Arab Palestine. The city of Jerusalem, which is sacred to Muslims, Christians, and Jews, is now a UN-controlled international zone. Jews accept the UN partition plan and declare independence as the State of Israel on May 15, 1948. Zionist gangs violently expel over 750,000 Palestinians from their homes and take their land, rendering them refugees as a result, on a day that is remembered as Al-Nakba, the catastrophe in Arabic. Neighboring Arab countries object to the land takeover, and on the day following the State of Israel Declaration of Independence, the First Arab-Israeli War breaks out. Israel is victorious and makes a grab for the land intended for the Palestinian state under the UN's partition plan. The land gets divided into three parts. Jordan occupies the West Bank and East Jerusalem, Egypt occupies Gaza, and the State of Israel takes 78% of historical Palestine, including West Jerusalem. Fast forward to 1967, amid ongoing tensions between Israel and neighboring Arab countries, the Six-Day War breaks out. And by the end of it, the map looks something like this. Palestine is now fully occupied by Israel. Despite the absence of a formal peace treaty, things start simmering down. Then Israelis start settling into Gaza and the West Bank, resulting in a Palestinian struggle that gives rise to the PLO. Their main goal, to liberate Palestine from Israel by any means necessary. Fighting goes on for years. The PLO eventually accepts the division of the land between Palestine and Israel, but the conflict doesn't end there. More settlers make their way into Israeli-occupied Palestinian territories. The international community considers this illegal. The frustration among Palestinians leads to an intifada, uprising in Arabic. As a result, Hamas is born as a political movement determined to fight against Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Palestine's Gaza. Aiming to decrease tensions, Israel and the PLO signed the first Oslo Accords in 1993 and the second in 1995. The agreements lead to the splitting of the occupied West Bank into three sections. Area A under full Palestinian control, Area B under joint Palestinian-Israeli control, and Area C under full Israeli control. But the solution creates a problem. Area C contains the majority of the occupied West Bank's agricultural land, water, and minerals. Palestinians have limited access to these. Further peace talks prove unsuccessful. Palestinians lose hope, resulting in the Second Intifada in 2000. And Israel begins constructing separation walls and building checkpoints to control and limit Palestinian movement.
Welcome everyone.
It's 2005.
And thank you for
Israel
joining us
withdraws
today.
from Gaza, but continues
This
to build
event is being hosted by the Anti-Racism Committee in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at Western University. I want to thank my colleagues on the committee, Victoria Wolf, David Heap, Julia Emberley, and Latte Lawson-Helu, for their work in organizing this event, and to our coordinator of public humanities at Western, Josh Lambier, for organizing and advertising this webinar. Thanks to the Dean's Office and our departments for their support. Special thanks to our panel of experts, Dr. Cheryl Nessel, Jasmine Zine, Randa Farah, and Jess Notwell, for agreeing to share their insights with us today. We're witnessing a genocide against Palestinian people. When I turned on the news this morning, the banner at the bottom of my TV screen showed that 27,947 Palestinians have been killed since October 7th. And so it's crucial to create spaces for critical conversations. Hence the title of today's talk, Neutrality to Nuance, Decolonization and Teaching Palestine. Based on the number of guests who registered for the webinar, it's clear that people are interested in finding community to learn and to teach about what we are witnessing. In the interest of time, we'll post the bio for each speaker in the chat. We'll also post links for colleagues and students at Western who may need mental health and wellness support to process the information we will hear today. Western students can contact the advising office in their home faculty for academic support and for information about other services available at the university. If you're joining us from outside of Western, we encourage you to seek support where you are and to take care of yourself. Each panelist will speak for 15 minutes in this order. Brenda Farah, Jasmine Zine, Cheryl Nestle, and Jess Notwell. If you would like to pose a question to our panelists, we have the question and answer function open today. You can pose your questions at any time during the event using the Q&A feature, and we'll have time reserved at the end of our presentation to address as many of them as the time allows. My colleague David Heap will moderate the Q&A discussion. But first, I'd like to invite my colleague, Jeff Tennant, to deliver the land acknowledgement for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. Bonjour, Sego, Assalamu alaikum, Shalom, good afternoon. As we're meeting virtually for this very important and timely event organized by Western's Faculty of Humanities Anti-Racism Committee, let me start by acknowledging a parcel of virtual land. The website of Western's Office of Indigenous Initiatives is a treasure trove of information for non-Indigenous folks like me to educate ourselves about the perspectives of Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island and about the great work being done by the brilliant communities of Indigenous faculty, staff, and students at Western. So search for Western Office of Indigenous Initiatives in your favorite search engine and explore. You'll find on the OII site a document entitled More Than Words, a guide to land acknowledgements at Western University. And the guide states, I quote, "Many Indigenous people are critical of land acknowledgements because they are often recited word for word, the same every time, with little or no reflection on the violence and ongoing nature of settler colonialism," end of quote. Western's land acknowledgement text contains a passage that can be taken as a starting point for reflection on the violence that is extensively documented in the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Quote, "We acknowledge historical and ongoing justices that Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit endure in Canada," end of quote. But we know that merely reciting such words about injustices is not enough. And while non-Indigenous folks certainly do need to educate ourselves about the violence perpetrated against the Indigenous peoples of these lands by Canadian institutions, specific reminders of those injustices will not be the focus of my brief remarks in this territorial acknowledgement this afternoon. Indeed, the top story, and it's the topic of today's webinar, in the international news for the past 4 months offers ample daily reminders of the historical and contemporary fact that Indigenous peoples experience horrific human rights violations when their ancestral lands are occupied by a settler colonialist power. Let me focus instead on the Indigenous brilliance that we all, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, have many opportunities to appreciate at Western, and I'm sure on other campuses of universities. Western being situated on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, Wakanata, Wanderan peoples. These are lands that are connected to some important treaties, London Township, Sombra Treaties, 1796, and of course, the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. Now, that Indigenous brilliance can be experienced through a rich program of educational events that are organized by the Office of Indigenous Initiatives, such as last June's National Building Reconciliation Forum, September events to mark National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. These events invite non-Indigenous members of the Western community and the broader community to join with Indigenous faculty, staff, and students at the Wampum Learning Lodge, which is a facility adjacent to the Faculty of Education building, to build relationships as we learn. That brilliance can also be appreciated in the scholarly work of a growing number of Indigenous faculty at Western, such as Dr. Candice Burnett de Bossiguet's book published just last month with University of Regina Press entitled Tricky Grounds, Indigenous Women's Experiences in Canadian University Administration. In her book, which masterfully integrates Indigenous storytelling into qualitative policy research, Dr. Burnett de Bossiguet points out the frustrations that Indigenous women working in university administration experience as they run up against the inertia of colonialist institutions. And to quote Candice Burnett de Bossiguet, In examining the trickiness of indigenizing policy enactments in academic contexts, possessive logics embedded in patriarchal white sovereignty of the university inevitably creep into policy processes in insidious ways that tend to reproduce settler colonial relations of power. These in turn create impossible dilemmas and messy divisions that undermine Indigenous sovereignty. End of quote. As a non-Indigenous faculty member at Western, I acknowledge my duty to work alongside my Indigenous colleagues in overcoming the obstacles that settler colonialism places in the way of decolonizing and indigenizing our institutions of higher education, because it's not enough to acknowledge the land. We need to ask ourselves constantly what we can do to contribute to giving the land back. Miigwech, shukran, toda. I'll now pass the floor to Julia Emberley, who will introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Jeff. That was wonderful. So I'm pleased to present our first speaker this afternoon, Dr. Rhonda Farah. Dr. Farah is a professor at Western University in the anthropology department, where her recent work focuses on Palestinian popular memory and reconstructions of identity. And this is based on her fieldwork in a refugee camp in Jordan. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Farah.
Thank you so much, everyone. Special thanks to the Faculty of Arts and Humanities Anti-Racism Committee for organizing this important panel and for inviting me. But I must begin by saying that my heart is very heavy today. It is not easy to talk about this while a genocide is unraveling in Gaza as we speak, and not to forget the West Bank, where people are being killed, injured, and Israeli military incursions have become regular events. Since October 7th, the Israeli military has killed over 28,000 Palestinians, injured some 68,000. Many others remain under the rubble. In addition, Israel, with the help of the US, Canada, and a few other so-called liberal democracies, have cut funds to UNRWA, a humanitarian organization, and are, according to many, thus participants in this horrific atrocity by starving Palestinians to death. The infrastructure has also been unintentionally destroyed. Nothing has survived. Hospitals, universities, UN installations, schools, homes, buildings have collapsed with bunker buster or phosphorus bombs and other deadly weapons. This includes bombing zones declared safe and where people thought they might take refuge. There is hardly any food, medicine, or clean water. Surgeries are being conducted without anesthesia, including the amputation of limbs, including like children and babies. Some 10,000 cancer patients are dying because they can't receive treatment. Children are drinking water they find in puddles in streets, causing many diseases. Many are kidnapped, including doctors, ordered out from hospitals and subjected to the most humiliating experiences, such as forcing them to strip naked, followed by unbearable torture. There are some 9,000 prisoners of war and hostages in Israeli prisons, more like dungeons, where invisible to the world, many have died because of torture and denial of life-saving medicines. But for us Palestinians, this is not new. It's a continuation of 75 years of ethnic cleansing. The scale and rhythm changed over the decades. Sometimes it is a house demolished in Jerusalem, a piece of land expropriated in a village, a few Palestinians killed while standing in front of their shops in Ramallah, or children shot at while walking to school. Other times it is on a massive scale, as it is today in Gaza. I was born in Haifa, my birthplace. 7 years earlier, Palestine was still Palestine, even though it had been under British colonial rule. And I want to show you the passports of my parents, because some people say there was no Palestine. In 1947-48, the consequences of the ethnic cleansing campaign was the destruction and depopulation of over 500 villages. Palestinian cities were emptied of most of their Arab inhabitants. In total, 750,000 Palestinians were uprooted, and 78% of historical, or some call mandatory, Palestine was occupied and renamed as Israel. My family was among the 150,000 Palestinians who survived the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. But the Palestinians who remained were placed under military rule from 1948 to 66, which limited our movement. We were not allowed to form our political parties or express any symbol attesting to our Palestinian national identity. And of course, our livelihood was severely affected. The new Jewish state expropriated 73% of the land and distributed homes and possessions of those who fled out of fear or were expelled to the newly arrived Jewish immigrants. We became involuntarily Palestinian citizens of Israel, treated as unwelcomed and unequal strangers on our own land, an impediment to the Zionist objective to build a Jewish state on the ruins of our ancient society. My family had moved to the West Bank in 1965, but 2 years later, in 1967, Israel occupied the remaining 22% of mandatory Palestine, that is the West Bank and Gaza. Once again, we lived under military rule. I remember the checkpoints, going to school, harassment, fear, and the knowledge that my land was being colonized. But perhaps the most frightening experience was in 1982. I was living in Beirut, Lebanon at the time, a new mother. My son was barely 6 months when Israeli Defense Minister Ariel Sharon led a massive military assault on Lebanon to destroy the Palestine Liberation Organization. The consequences were horrific. Over 20,000 were killed. Some sources suggest 30,000, both Palestinians and Lebanese. A promise by the Americans that Israel would not enter Beirut if the PLO cadres left, which they did, encouraged my parents to leave Beirut and visit family here in Canada. I remained with the baby, believing the war was over. But the Israelis decided to invade Beirut, and between the 16th and 18th of September, they surrounded the Sabra Shatila refugee camps, shelling them, and let in the members of the Lebanese Phalange Party with axes and knives to go in and slaughter the refugees. This included pregnant women. Yes?
Do you have slides to share? You mentioned some images.
Yeah. Maybe I'll get these later because I wanted to show where my parents are from and where I was born before 1940, like the images of Palestine before 48. Rumors began to spread that similar atrocities were going to happen in other parts of Beirut. This is when I decided to escape on a cargo ship to Cyprus, from there to Wales in the UK, where my brother lives, and sometime later to Canada. In Canada, I managed to return to university. And in my research, I focused on Palestinian refugees, spending a few years in Jordan gathering oral histories. I also conducted research in Sahrawi refugee camps. This is to say, I teach many courses on refugees, on exile, memory, history, identity, on humanitarianism, and related topics. To teach about Palestinian history, one must have some general idea about the region as a whole, but stereotypes that circulate are very difficult to dislodge. What students do know about the Arabs and Muslims are in the form of cliches and images they imbibe through mainstream media, official discourse, and through Hollywood films, which consistently portray Arabs and Muslims as stupid, rich, violent, uncivilized, dishonest. Thus, as an instructor, it is not only about the absence of knowledge I have to think about, but I usually spend a great deal of time to deconstruct these Orientalist assumptions. However, it is much more challenging to teach about Palestine and the Palestinians. There is a culture of fear surrounding the topic. Over the 22 years I taught, I learned that instructors and students alike automatically censor themselves, evoking here Foucault's panopticon. One learns almost instinctively that speaking about Palestinians and their tragic history will put them or their institution at risk and might provoke a deluge of attacks and threats. It is this self-censoring that has contributed to a wall of silence and erasure when it comes to the Palestinians. And only if many of us speak out can this censorship begin to loosen its grip. Before I lecture thus on Palestinian refugees, I have to begin with a very long introduction. For example, I begin by repositioning the Palestinians from the realm of absence to that of presence, from the zone of obfuscated objects to historical subjects, from terrorists and refugees to a people nation. The second thing I do is I find myself filling slides with an extensive list naming Jewish organizations and individuals who are anti-Zionist and are or critical of Israeli policies. I do this to show students that it is never anti-Semitic to criticize Israeli state policies or Zionism, just as it is never anti-Canadian or anti-Christian or to criticize the Canadian government and teach about its colonial settler history and present struggles of indigenous people on Turtle Island. This also means that those who attempt to criticize me as biased realize that my aim is exactly the opposite. I do not support the Palestinian struggle because I'm Palestinian, but because it is a just cause, and Jews who support the Palestinians don't do so because they are self-hating Jews, but because they also believe in fighting for justice and freedom for all peoples. Another thing I do is I bring a historical perspective to dismantle the erroneous myth and assumption of an ancient feud between Arabs or Muslims and Jews. In fact, the historical record shows quite the opposite. It is Europe that should be ashamed of its very long history of persecuting Jews. Whereas in the Arab Muslim world, Arab Jews flourished and were fully integrated into society until Zionism emerged and Israel was established. The ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians comes always as a complete surprise to students. Most had never heard of the Nakba or the history of exile. For decades, Israel has injected falsehoods, rewriting the history of Palestine by reinscribing it as exclusively Jewish, and by recasting the Palestinian victims as victimizers. These narratives over time fashion a structure of feeling, difficult to dismantle, an emotive reaction that holds Israel as a Western civilized bastion, whereas Palestinians as violent and obstacles to peace. Or as NDP former Minister Selina Robinson has recently said, Palestine was a scrappy piece of land. Yes, there were a few 100,000 people on it. Yes, indeed, her terra nullius scrap indeed. Teaching about Palestine, one knows that they will definitely hear about it. In my experience, I was accused of bias, lack of objectivity, of not being neutral. These are well-known tactics. Richard Falk, a former UN rapporteur on human rights violations, described them as politics of deflection, where the messengers are attacked and forced to defend themselves, and in the process, the actual message, in this case, what is happening to the Palestinians, is lost. The problems inherent in such accusations become clear when applied to other indigenous and aboriginal histories and present struggles, or when lecturing about slavery or apartheid in South Africa. Where is the balance between slave and slaveholder? Imagine if students complained that the instructor did not present the Afrikaners or colonizers' point of view. Is not the relationship between colonizer and colonized inherently unequal and imbalanced? I want to stop here. But before I do that, and as always, ceasefire now. And this is like, these are the slides. This is Palestine, my mother's city of birth, Nazareth. This is a picture of in the 1920s. This is my father's town, Shafa Amer, 1910.
We can't see them, Randa. Can you share the screen?
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. Hold on. Yeah. Yeah, okay. Sorry. So this is, again, this is Nazareth in 1920s. And I'm doing this especially for Robinson, so she knows it wasn't a scrappy piece of land. This is the town of Shafa Amer, where my father is from, 1910. This is Haifa. If you look closely, the caption says you can see the huge oil tanks by Palestine Oil Refinery of 1937. So these are images before 1948. And this is just a map of Palestine and the territorial loss, how, colonial expansion on Palestinian territory. And to tell you what it looks like, ethnic cleansing looks like, and the destruction of villages, this actually happened in 1960, it's a couple of days probably after 1967. This is a biblical town, a very, very ancient village called Nuance. It was destroyed, and this is what destruction looks like. And then Canada Park was planted on the ruins of the village. So the myth that it was an empty land became a reality when the original landscape, the houses, the trees, the original flora and fauna of Palestine were destroyed, and then and over the ruins we have parks and the JNF attempts to create a green Palestine, quote unquote. So that's it from me.
Thank you, Rhonda. Our second speaker today is Dr. Yasmin Zine. Dr. Zine is a professor of sociology and religion and culture at Wilfrid Laurier University. She is well known as an expert on Islamophobia, and we're delighted to have her here with us today. Please welcome Dr. Zine.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to begin by also thanking Rhonda for her very powerful and moving presentation, and to say that we are all standing with you in grief and in solidarity. Like many of us, I've spent the past several months in a whirlwind of grief and horror, trying to maneuver my way through this massive, soul-crushing haze. As this horrific genocide in Gaza continues to unfold, as a Muslim and a scholar of racism and Islamophobia studies, I have felt a profound sense of post-9/11 deja vu. I wrote a book on how Muslim communities, especially youth, navigated that fraught context called Under Siege, Islamophobia, and the 9/11 generation. But the circumstances we are facing now are worse than what we saw in the aftermath of 9/11. I want to outline some of the lessons that we can draw from the post-9/11 context that apply to our understanding of the present, and discuss what this tells us about the context of Islamophobia that has evolved and become even more ingrained in Canadian society and globally since then. I argue that compared to the aftermath of 9/11 over 20 years ago, it's worse now because over those past 2 decades, Islamophobia has laid the groundwork that has made it easier to collectively label and punish Muslim populations, as we're seeing now in Gaza and in Palestine. The global war on terror has been underpinned by racist ideologies, casting nearly 2 billion people around the world as violent, fanatical terrorists who threaten democracy, the stability of white nations, and Western civilization. The situation is worse now than after 9/11 because Islamophobia's ideological playlist has expanded. We see racist Orientalist tropes have now been further instrumentalized and weaponized as propaganda. For example, we've been hearing politicians referring to rallies and other efforts to support Palestinian people amidst unimaginable suffering as, quote, glorifications of violence. This language was even used in some university statements. This rhetoric falls back on racist narratives that have long associated Muslims and Palestinians with terrorism. These false equations rely on vilifying Orientalist tropes that are common within anti-Palestinian racism and Islamophobia playbooks, and are used to silence political dissent, delegitimate decolonial struggles, and demonize entire populations. We're also hearing dehumanizing references to Palestinians as human animals, barbaric, and monsters, reproducing the idioms of colonial racism that were used to justify and authorize imperial campaigns of violence. Recently, as Rhonda mentioned, we saw the BC Minister for Post-Secondary Education, Selena Robinson, publicly state that modern Israel was founded on, quote, a crappy piece of land, invoking the colonial narrative terra nullius. She went on to state that, quote, there were several 100,000 people, but other than that, it didn't produce an economy. Her words took a page out of the white settler colonial playbook to justify imperial domination and occupation and whitewash the violence associated with that project. And yet, scholars who are best placed to challenge and expose and correct these racist narratives and highlight their consequences are faced with reprisal, recrimination, threats, and harassment when they speak out. While in Palestine, cultural genocide has led to the destruction of countless universities and schools in what has been termed scholasticide. Another way that it is worse now than after 9/11 is because since then, the War on Terror playbook on how to subjugate Muslim populations has been passed down not only among the fraternity of white colonial and white settler nations, paving the way for Palestinian genocide, but also to countries like China, Myanmar, and India, where we're witnessing various anti-Muslim campaigns that range from ethnic cleansing and genocide to the mass internment of Muslims in so-called re-education camps, in Orwellian forms of surveillance, as well as in the systemic manifestations of Islamophobia and state policies globally. In recognizing Islamophobia as a global condition, it's important to take stock of the similarities of its pathways in these contexts, as well as acknowledging some of the political distinctions within these intersectional forms of violence and oppression. For example, Islamophobia has always been intimately tied to the question of Palestine, but anti-Palestinian racism as one of its intersections has some distinct characteristics like Nakba denial and denying the indigeneity and human rights and dignity of Palestinians, for example. And on our home front, let's not forget that Canada leads the G7 in terms of targeted killings of Muslims motivated by Islamophobia. We have witnessed 2 deadly attacks against Canadian Muslims since 2017, including the London, Ontario attack in 2021, which is close to home for those of you at UWO. And there have been numerous hate incidents that have escalated in this country over the past 2 decades and now exceed the level that we saw after 9/11, with a reported 1,300% increase since October 7th. We have now also seen heavily funded Islamophobia networks operating since 2010. The Islamophobia industry, which is the name for these networks in the United States, circulates $1.5 billion through 39 anti-Muslim organizations to promote Islamophobic propaganda. In Canada, Islamophobia is also organized, orchestrated, networked, and monetized through groups that include white nationalists, far-right media, Islamophobia influencers, Muslim dissidents, pro-Israel fringe right groups, Hindutva activists, conservative think tanks, and their designated security experts, who all promote demonizing anti-Muslim campaigns. And I have detailed all of this in a 250-page report I wrote on the Canadian Islamophobia industry. And I wanted to signal that just so that we understand the organized and orchestrated nature of a lot of the backlash and campaigns that we are seeing right now. The Islamophobic and anti-Palestinian campaigns gain even more traction now because we're living in a post-truth world where disinformation campaigns, conspiracy theories, and Muslim scare stories are disseminated on numerous platforms like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, as well as through scores of blogs and websites that didn't exist back in 2001. And there are now networked subcultures that globally traffic in these false narratives. Also, since 9/11, we have seen the fortification of the security state, with policies that promote racial profiling and securitization. For more than a decade, for example, Muslim student associations at Canadian universities have been subject to visits by security agencies like CSIS, the RCMP, counterterrorism policing units, because they are part of this 9/11 generation who are seen as potential radicals and extremists. These apparatuses of racial governmentality have now become embedded within state policies and practices and are easily operationalized against Palestinian and Muslim youth and communities at large now. For example, recently, Toronto police showed up at a talk given by my friend and colleague, Dr. Mohamed Ayash, a Palestinian scholar who was invited to speak at York University. The unwarranted interruption by police sent the message that his talk on Palestine might be disruptive to the public good and required police surveillance and oversight. Now, this is all part of the rising neo-McCarthyism and the silencing of free speech and academic freedom that we're witnessing now on a daily basis. This was shockingly evident in a speech at the Ontario Legislature by the Minister of Colleges and Universities, Jill Dunlop, who publicly doxed students and professors that she deemed as, quote, glorifying and celebrating violence, supporting atrocities like rape, torture, mass murder, and inciting and justifying violence, terrorism, and hate, because of their activism in support of Palestinian people. And she called for universities to impose disciplinary actions against their alleged misconduct. So after that statement, not only did the publicly named students and faculty now have a target on their back, but we're seeing student groups across the country censured, sanctioned, defunded, and sued for their support of Palestine. Every day, we are also hearing new cases of staff and faculty at universities under attack for signing open letters or retweeting posts that in any way question or challenge Israeli policies and racist narratives. This includes the removal of UWO's Muslim chaplain, Arij Anwar, for social media posts that he made that were deemed divisive when they were simply challenging and correcting demonizing misinformation campaigns and underscoring the violent actions of the Israeli state. Can we imagine universities being so quick to fire faculty and staff or suspend students if they criticize Canada in the same way? How many Indigenous and racialized folks and their allies would be terminated if that was the case? So make no mistake, free speech on our campuses is under siege and academic freedom is now being imperiled in unprecedented ways. We can all agree that real anti-Semitism should be vigorously opposed and challenged, but we must separate this out from organized campaigns of political censorship that conflate criticism of Israel's policies with anti-Semitism. I want to just sort of end by talking about some successes within the university sector, because we are also highlighting how many concerns there are that are ongoing and the struggles and challenges that we face when we want to talk about Palestine within our university classrooms and in communities, or within our academic work and public scholarship. So I want to just flag some a successful intervention that happened. So that was back in 2021. If we think about that period when the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, known as the IHRA or IRA, definition of anti-Semitism was at that time widely rejected by 40 faculty associations and unions, as well as the Canadian Association of University Teachers, representing 120 universities and colleges across the country, and the Ontario Confederation of University Faculty Associations, who passed motions against its adoption on the grounds that it labels criticism of Israel as a racist endeavor to be anti-Semitic. Now, this not only violates academic freedom, but it silences anti-racist and decolonial critiques, scholarship, and activism. In fact, Elon Musk banned the term decolonization on Twitter, or X, labeling its use as anti-Semitic and tantamount to promoting genocide, effectively erasing decolonization as part of the historical struggles against genocide and white supremacy globally. But when scholars point out these facts, they are subject to shadow banning on social media and may later face censure and sanction from their universities. Did we ever imagine a day where scholars, and especially racialized scholars, would have to fight to reclaim the language of decolonization, white settler colonialism, apartheid, white supremacy, and racism from this level of political censorship? Meanwhile, racist discourses circulate with impunity and provide the rationale for genocidal violence. But if that's not enough, think about this. Because of their critical work on Israel, under the IRA definition, teaching the work of Palestinian legend Edward Said, influential Jewish scholars like Hannah Arendt and Judith Butler, or renowned African scholar Akile Membe, as well as Black liberation scholar Angela Davis, among many others, could be deemed anti-Semitic. So let's be clear, no state is above critique. creating an exception is a dangerous and slippery slope for academic freedom, and we should all be gravely concerned about such moves. And yet, the IRA definition was adopted by the federal government and can now potentially impact decisions made by national funding bodies like the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. As a personal example, last year, under the headline, quote, "Another Israel supercritic gets funding from the Trudeau Liberals," National Post writer Barbara Kay suggested that my views on Israel should somehow disqualify me from receiving federal funding for my research on Islamophobia. Prior to this, there were campaigns to have my research defunded. The IRA definition has also impacted the Department of Canadian Heritage. For example, new policies at Canadian Heritage require that grantees must attest to the IRA definition of anti-Semitism in order to receive or keep their funding. These measures effectively require applicants to sign away their rights to criticize Israel. So as we can see, university autonomy, free speech and expression and academic freedom have long been subject to pervasive threats, and this is being further exacerbated in the current political climate. So as a response to these ongoing concerns, in 2021, the No IRA academic campaign was spearheaded by the Academic Alliance Against Anti-Semitism, Racism, Colonialism, and Censorship in Canada, which we go by the acronym ARC. And this alliance was formed by me, Cheryl Nestle, who's joining us today, Larry Haven from Independent Jewish Voices, Mohamed Ayash, Diala Hamza, and Greg Bird. In partnership with Independent Jewish Voices, we created a handbook called The IRA Definition of Anti-Semitism for Canadian Colleges and Universities, What You Need to Know. And we developed a sample motion for faculty associations and unions that outlined the concerns that it posed for academic freedom in the university sector. And some of those links are in the chat. And so as a follow-up in response to the dire political context we're now facing, ARC also started a new campaign addressing the ongoing McCarthyism at Canadian universities and the need for renewed vigilance against threats to academic freedom. ARC put out an emergency statement and sample motion that can be found on the Faculty of Palestine website, and I'll direct you to the chat again for that link. And already 11 universities and faculty associations have passed this new motion, and many others are discussing it in recognition of the unprecedented times that we're facing that threaten our scholarly autonomy as teachers and researchers. The fears and concerns that came with the No IRA academic campaign back in 2021 are being realized across the university sector, where there has been unprecedented silencing and suppression that sparks fear and self-censorship, as Randa mentioned, especially among untenured and contract faculty. Racialized faculty are among the most targeted and vulnerable in these campaigns, and many lack support in their institutions when they experience backlash. These repressive tactics that we're witnessing must be challenged, and scholars must be free from all forms of recrimination and harassment that may occur due to the nature of their teaching and research. And I would also implore all of you to contact your EDI departments and leaders and call them into account if they fail to include anti-Palestinian racism in their statements. EDI at Canadian colleges and universities have reduced decolonization to performative acts that do nothing to challenge the structures of power that sustain colonialism and white supremacy. So as a final note on the post 9/11 context, and now, 9/11 was that watershed moment, the kind of moment when people look back now and they ask each other, where were they when those events happened? But what's different now is that when people look back on this moment, the question will not be, where were you when this happened? But rather the question will be, what did you do when this happened? And so now is the time to stand up and be counted. So please do not write or teach about this moment from a safe distance years down the road if you don't stand up and speak about it and teach about it now. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin. So I'd like now to introduce our third speaker today, Dr. Cheryl Nestle. In addition to her award-winning scholarship, Dr. Nestle is an important activist in combating the suppression of free speech on Palestine by faculty, students, and activists in Canada. She is also an affiliated scholar at New College, University of Toronto. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cheryl Nestle.
Thank you, Julia, very much. Yeah, I want to congratulate the organizers and everybody supporting this webinar. It is not easy to put these on these days, and I've spoken to a number in the last 4 months, and there hasn't been one instance where the organizers have not gotten pushback before and after the event for presenting outspoken scholars and others on what's going on in Gaza right now. So what I want to talk about here today is the intensification of attacks on scholars and scholarship related to Palestine since October 7th, and it follows on a lot of what Jasmine was saying. I say intensified because these attacks are not a new phenomenon, but rather one that has been happening for years. So in addition to highlighting some of the most recent incidents, I will showcase a comprehensive report released in October 2022 by Independent Jewish Voices, with which I'm affiliated, about the suppression of speech on Palestine in Canadian universities. And what this offers us is a baseline for how suppression has functioned up until this point, and it explores some of the mechanisms through which academic freedom of expression has been stifled by creating a chilly climate of intimidation and coerced silence. And I want to emphasize that we should not let the important struggles for freedom of expression and for the right to narrate Palestine here distract us from our obligation to keep uppermost in our minds the destruction of Palestinian life that is taking place at the moment. And I think both speakers who came before me, Jasmine and Randa, have kept that uppermost in their minds. And the impact of the last 4 months has been extraordinary on so many people. So before I'm turning to what's happening here in Canada, I want to foreground the unbearable and unforgivable destruction of the means of knowledge production, preservation, and dissemination in Gaza, which has been described by Oxford scholar Carmen Abulsi as scholasticide, as Jasmine mentioned, or educide, as some people say. Not one university in Gaza remains standing. Over 240 faculty and educators and 4,800 students have been killed in Israeli bombings. 90,000 students in Gaza can no longer attend university. There has been total destruction of countless archives, libraries, museums, and other repositories of Palestinian culture and knowledge. This is part and parcel of genocide, and I fully expect this to be brought forward when the ICJ makes its pronouncements about whether genocide has been committed by Israel in Gaza. So suppression of speech on Palestine in Western academia is part of a well-coordinated apparatus aimed at discrediting and silencing oppositional voices in the last 4 months to justifying a genocidal war in Palestine. Accusations of anti-Semitism, again, as Jasmine mentioned, have been absolutely central, and a main strategy is to silence and intimidate academics and activists who advocate for Palestinian human rights. And as somebody who teaches anti-Semitism training sessions and has written on anti-Semitism and keeps a very close eye on this, this is particularly difficult for me to cope with because I see these false accusations really causing incredible damage. So allegations of Jew hatred directed at supporters of justice for Palestine constitute a strategy conceptualized by the Israeli government in partnership with Jewish communal leaderships, national and international Jewish organizations, pro-Israel advocacy groups, institutional arms of the Israeli government, and academics and researchers promoting the idea of a new anti-Semitism in which they claim Israel is demonized as the Jew among nations. University of Pennsylvania political scientist Ian Lustig has argued that the lobby constitutes a vigilante force, which has made it increasingly difficult to criticize Israel without fear of lawsuits, accusations of anti-Semitism, demands for political balance in staging of events, blacklisting of participants, or other forms of personal or institutional harassment. Another rhetorical weapon frequently used by Israel advocates, and both Randa and Jasmine brought this up, is the claim that pro-Palestinian activists are supporters of terrorism. Indeed, terrorist and Palestinian have become virtual synonyms in the pro-Israel lexicon. These accusations must be seen as a feature of what is now recognized as anti-Palestinian racism, and I would refer you to a groundbreaking report issued by the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association, ACLA, which offers a collaboratively developed description of anti-Palestinian racism, and you can find that on their website. So the tens of thousands of Canadians demonstrating for a ceasefire in Gaza have been characterized by some journalists and Israel supporting organizations as variously pro-Hamas mobs, terror supporters, and unrepentant anti-Semites. One only has to be sympathetic to the Palestinian plight to be defamed by accusations of anti-Semitism, an accusation even leveled at pro-Palestinian Jews like myself. Some Jews, however, particularly students, have expressed feeling fear when they encounter protests or symbols or slogans of Palestinian resistance, even if they were not subjected to violence or harassment by demonstrators. And I want to make a distinction between this fear response and that which Jews have felt in the wake of actual attacks since October 7th on Jewish communal sites, including fire bombings, bomb threats, and shooting into unoccupied synagogues. These acts unequivocally constitute anti-Semitism, and it is understandable that they evoke a response of fear. However, how do we understand the kind of anticipatory fear in response to calls for a ceasefire or to the display of a Palestinian flag? As Sarah Ahmed notes, the question of fear is shown to be structural and mediated rather than an immediate bodily response to an objective danger. Fear is a response to the threat of violence, but the threat itself is shaped by the authorization of narratives about what is and what is not threatening, and about who are and who are not the appropriate objects of fear. As I mentioned earlier, discourses of threat and violence are commonly used to characterize Palestinians, thus rendering claims of fear of pro-Palestine demonstrators and symbols completely plausible, even in the absence of evidence of harm. I want to mention just a few of the incidents of suppression of speech on Palestine that have occurred in Canadian academia since October 7th. And Jasmine's already gone over what happened to our friend and colleague Muhammad Ayash, who's a full professor of sociology at Mount Royal University, when he went to give his invited lecture last Friday, entitled "The Palestinian Struggle for Liberation, Aspirations for a Decolonial Life." And, you know, 3 Toronto police officers entered and stood at the front of the room. I must say I was struck when I saw the photos that were sent, because it was a very small crowd. It was 15 or 20 people. But the police had been called not by the university. We still don't know who called them. A week later, it should be very easy to find out, but the York administration has not released that information, nor have they publicly apologized to Muhammad. And that is obviously a complete violation of academic freedom. At Western, as Jasmine mentioned, Arij Anwar was fired after responding, the Muslim chaplain responding to an egregious tweet by former Senator Linda Frum. And if you follow her, as unfortunately I have to, on Twitter, she says some really awful racist things. What he was doing was excoriating her for claiming that a pro-Palestine demonstration was, quote, an orgy of celebration for the beheading of babies. That's Linda Frum. And if that doesn't require a strong response, I don't know what does. The other thing that's happening is multi-million-dollar class action lawsuits have been filed on behalf of Jewish students against UBC, York, Queens, Concordia, McMaster, and Toronto Metropolitan University. The McMaster case is a $77 million case. And these were filed by the discredited law firm Diamond and Diamond, in which it is claimed that universities have failed to protect Jewish students from anti-Semitism. And another thing that has happened is that after students at the TMU Law School posted an open letter in response to the October 7th Hamas attack that they claimed sought to contextualize the assault, a firestorm erupted. Law firms were encouraged by the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs to check the list of student signatories to the letter and refrain from offering them positions. Several large law firms withdrew funding for major scholarships, and an investigator has been brought in to evaluate this situation. B'nai B'rith Canada, which claims to be a human rights advocacy group, brought a legal case to the Quebec Superior Court against a policy against genocide in Palestine, adopted by 78% of the undergrads who voted in a referendum held by the Student Society of McGill. The referendum cannot now be ratified until the court decides its constitutionality on March 24th. In the academic medical world, and I think this has really flown under the radar, doctors who have spoken critically about Israel's war in Gaza have been targeted by their peers. Dr. Tarek Lubani, who was wounded by Israeli troops while volunteering during the Great March of Return in Gaza in 2018, has carefully documented this on Twitter or X. This intimidation has included calling for the exclusion from prestigious residency programs of doctors who have signed open letters or petitions against the war in Gaza, and the firing of at least one doctor from a residency program at the University of Ottawa for pro-Palestine posts. There are many more such events, but time prevents me from covering them all. The picture in the US is even more alarming. I'd need like 2 hours to talk about it. In December, Palestine Legal, which supports people facing suppression of speech on Palestine, had logged more than 1,000 requests for help, and that was 2 months ago. As I mentioned earlier, this is not new, and what I'd like to talk now about is the baseline for silencing of pro-Palestinian scholars, what that looked like before October 7th. So in early 2021, as the intensification of this harassment, intimidation, and even litigation against Palestine solidarity activists became more apparent, I co-authored with Rowan Gaudet a 100-page research report for Independent Jewish Voices Canada, documenting how these tactics and the aggressive campaign for the adoption of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which considers strong criticism of Israel to be anti-Semitic, were creating a chilling effect on advocacy for Palestine, particularly in academia. What emerged from our research was evidence of this vastly consequential and largely undocumented chilling effect upon teaching, knowledge production, and activism related to the struggle for justice in Palestine. In all, we collected 77 testimonies from 40 faculty members, 23 students, 7 activists, and 7 representatives of organizations. Testimonies came from participants working at 21 universities in 7 provinces. They represented 11 disciplines, and 82% of our interviewees occupied tenured or tenure-track academic positions. In analyzing the data, we identified the following categories, which reflected respondents' experiences: political intervention into hiring, restrictions on academic freedom, self-censorship in relation to Palestine, which Randa mentioned, fear about the potential impact of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, harassment by pro-Israel advocacy groups and media outlets, attacks from academic colleagues, the role of ethnic, racial, and religious identity and the experience of harassment, the emotional impact of self-censorship, harassment, and suppression of speech, political interference by university administration, classroom and social media surveillance, sexist and homophobic slurs, anti-Palestinian and anti-Arab racism and Islamophobia, threats of violence, including death threats and threats of sexual violence. And it's very important for me to note here, as others have, that Palestinian academics and students appear to be the most profoundly affected by the chilly climate, along with racialized faculty members and students. And I want to just interject here that this report, which was endorsed by 12 major international scholars and local scholars, including the former head of CAUT, Canadian Association of University Teachers, has never gotten any traction at all from academia, including from the Canadian Association of University Teachers, which I found to be profoundly disturbing because the empirical evidence is so absolutely clear. So I want to get just a little bit into some of the details of the report. Unfortunately, I have very little time, but I highly recommend that you go to www.ijvcanada.org. I think there is a link that's supposed to be put in the chat to the report itself. So in terms of hiring, several respondents reported participating in or witnessing hiring processes where the candidate's political position on Palestine was used as evidence that they could be predisposed to discriminate against students who did not share their views. Candidates who had expressed critical views on Israel were seen as potentially divisive for the department where the hiring was taking place. In some instances, Jewish department members expressed that they would feel unsafe if a candidate perceived to be pro-Palestine were to be hired. In terms of academic freedom, several faculty members reported that submissions to academic journals and book publishers were met with negative reviews, citing the author's critical stance on Israeli human rights violations. 3 interviewees disclosed that articles that they were told had been accepted for inclusion in journals or edited collections did not appear in the final publications. In several incidents, submissions critical of Israel were withdrawn by the editors from the publication at the last minute or reported to be lost. Self-censorship has been big. Reports of self-censorship figure prominently in the research findings. As one respondent commented, I purposely would avoid discussing Israeli settler colonialism in my classes, even when relevant to our studies, in fear of being labeled as an anti-Semite and of not being promoted to tenure. To me, this is an effective campaign to censor critics. Another respondent quipped, I'm not going to lie to you. I don't teach about Palestine, and that's an intentional risk aversion. In our research, we found that one of the reasons for self-censoring was respondents' precarious academic status as pre-tenure faculty or as academic job seekers. The impact of precarity on the practice of self-censoring on issues related to Israel-Palestine should not be underestimated. Several interviewees reported that as pre-tenure faculty, they avoided teaching, researching, or speaking about Palestine. Surveillance, and this is one that gets my goat. Half of the faculty members we interviewed reported being targeted by campus pro-Israel student groups and or by external pro-Israel advocacy groups. Among these activities were attempts to shut down or forcefully disrupt campus events about Palestine, the launching of public slander campaigns against pro-Palestinian faculty, and the lodging of complaints with university administrators against faculty. In addition, we identified 128 Canadians, including 89 students and 34 professors, who have been targeted by Canary Mission, a site which publicly identifies and vilifies hundreds of Palestinian human rights activists, and students. Irish scholar David Landy characterizes sites like Canary Mission as a virtual panopticon to put all academics on notice that they will be observed and attacked should they criticize Israel. We were not surprised to learn that scholars who identify as Palestinian reported having been profoundly affected by harassment and intimidation. As might be expected, these incidents were saturated with anti-Palestinian and anti-Arab racism and Islamophobia. One Palestinian respondent described the emotional impact of working in an academic setting where scholarship on Palestinian human rights is unwelcome. And this person said, the threatening environment is always there. Just being of Palestinian origin turns my life into a constant struggle to validate that there is such a thing as a Palestinian with a past, present, and future. The issue of Palestine has been described as a poison chalice, inasmuch as the imperative to educate about the history and current situation for Palestinians and about the role played by local and global power hierarchies coexists alongside the awareness that doing so poses significant personal and professional risks that have only intensified since October 7th. The injurious impact of the Chile climate on advocates for Palestinian human rights gives us legitimate cause to worry about freedom of expression and dissent and about the growing toxicity of discourse around the struggle for Palestinian freedom. However, as Nick Reimer reminds us, the normalization of violations of academic freedom means that the case for Palestinian universities should be made first with reference to the scandal of Israeli apartheid and only secondly on more procedural academic grounds. The chilling effect is largely a stratagem designed to foster denial of the unendurable reality of settler colonialism in Israel-Palestine. Surely we must oppose this on many grounds. However, the ultimate goal should be to break through the discourses of denial in order to champion and amplify the Palestinian experience, a history and a present that urgently cries for justice.
Thank you, Cheryl. I'm pleased now to present Dr. Jess Notwell, our fourth and final speaker. Dr. Jess Notwell is a citizen of the Métis Nation of Ontario and a two-spirit, mom, activist, and assistant professor at King's University College. Her work focuses on enacting decolonization and co-liberation grounded in decolonial love. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jess Notwell.
Is that okay? All right. Keenan Askamagnan, thank you. Just a note that my pronouns are they, them. It's an honor to sit in circle today with Randa, with Jasmine, with Cheryl, with Erica, with David, and with everyone who's taken your time to be here with us today. Keenan Askamagnan, thank you. Today I'll be speaking about my teaching, where it comes from and why, teaching decolonization and collective care from Turtle Island to Palestine. I'm going to introduce myself in Nehiao, in Cree, in my language. That's part of our protocols. So Tanse Tawao, Jess Nitsi Gasan, Migiso Getsuao, Nigo Twesiquitas Guinos Desmoyas Wiwin, Otiniakeati, Nehio Katemimisot Sikmuniao, Gisquegonesquio, Deshkan Ziving Megwatsnivigan. So I'm Jess. My family's ancestral territory is Treaty 6 in Key, Saskatchewan, or Northern Saskatchewan. I'm Eagle Clan, Neheo Métis on my mom's side. So my Métis family names are McLeod and Mackenzie, and White Settler on my dad's side, and a guest on these territories. And a mom of two amazing Palestinian children, which is also part of why I do the work that I do and an important context. I want my children to have the opportunity to grow up in the context of ongoing genocides on Turtle Island, in Palestine, and of course elsewhere in the world, in Sudan, in Congo, and additional places. I want them to have the chance to become adults. We have lost 5 family members in the West Bank since the 7th of October, one of whom was my children's favorite cousin and one their favorite uncle. And one day after seeing something on the news, our daughter turned to my partner when she saw a little girl who'd been in the bombing in Gaza, and she said, "Baba, am I next?" It's not scholarship, it's not activism about those people over there. These are our lives, these are our children, this is our past and our future, these are our territories, and why we do the work that we do in relationship with Palestinian, Muslim, Arab, Indigenous students and community. My teaching work is also rooted in my PhD research, so I just wanted to mention it for one moment. My dissertation is called Decolonization is an Everyday Struggle in Palestine, a collective practice of freedom rooted in Sakitowin, decolonial love. And just for context, I lived for 2 years in Palestine doing my research. And so my teaching research pedagogy is rooted both in Nehiao and Anishinaabe traditional teachings I carry from my elders, my gifts from my ancestors, and what I learned from the Palestinian women, their families, communities, ancestors in the land with whom I did research about decolonial love. And a quote from one of the women I interviewed when I was in Palestine, because their voices, their wisdom, their truth is really important in this story. And so Kifah, not her real name, but Kifah, she said, "You see, in Palestine, we don't choose to be active. You're under a settler colonial occupation, and it's normal that any people under a colonial situation, they fight. So imagine for a people, a whole country. For me, every means you use to resist is very valuable. Mahmoud Darwish did it in his poetry, and for us, he's a fighter for freedom. Hassan Hanafani, he writes, the one who dances the folklore for us is a fighter. They are fighting for our Palestinian national identity. And the one that chooses armed struggle, they are fighters also. Everybody is needed. The writer, the poet, the academic, the artist, and the fighter. Sometimes you need to do a demonstration, but sometimes you need to be part of the armed struggle. To be a university teacher, it's also resistance. When you teach young students about your country, about Palestine, it is also part of the resistance. So it doesn't matter the way you choose, all are valuable for me. For me, we are all one whole resistance. And so from Kifah, I thought about the importance of teaching at university, the role we can play accompanying communities and accompanying students on this journey toward decolonization, this journey of decolonization, this journey for co-liberation, for freedom. For me, what it means to teach decolonization from Turtle Island to Palestine is to recognize colonialism and coloniality. So from Nelson Mandela Torres, to recognize colonialism as that political and economic relation, which people are so familiar with in many parts of the world, where the colonizer has that extractive relationship, but isn't necessarily everyone moving in. And settler colonialism, of course, where the colonizer does move in. I mean, we see that this here on Turtle Island, and we see it in Palestine. But then coloniality, what she calls a long-standing patterns of power that emerged as a result of colonialism. They define culture, labor, intersubjective relations, knowledge production. And so we see that, right? We see that in what Rhonda and Jasmine and Cheryl have taught us about today in their wisdom and their teachings. We see those relationships in the suppression of teaching about Palestine, in the violence of the genocide as well, those patterns of power, both in an ongoing colonial situation in Palestine and an ongoing colonial situation here, and how they define every interaction, every colonial narrative, every colonial logic. And so decoloniality then is the dismantling of those relations of domination that constitute coloniality. And for me, the way I walk through co-liberation rooted in decolonial love, in care, in life, in thriving, and in beloved community. And in Black History Month, and every single day, but in Black History Month, drawing on Martin Luther King Jr.'s wisdom about beloved community, in which we can embrace and welcome and foster and ensure the full humanity of all people, free of poverty, free of racism, free of militarism, free of genocide. It's really powerful to be walking or in his footsteps, I guess, in this work also. I know this has been very clear today in this webinar, but also just to reaffirm that no matter what colonial logics or narratives are pushed forward, whether you're trying to civilize us, whether you're trying to render the land productive with the narrative that Indigenous people don't know how, greenwashing now has become huge, although it has been for a long time, but now the term is here. Whether you're trying to say that we don't know how to take care of our children, whether you're trying to say that our very existence is violent or terrorist or threatening, settler colonialism is really always about stealing land. And so you can see that in these two sets of maps, one of the northern part of Turtle Island and one of Palestine, and the shrinking land under the guardianship of the Indigenous people of the land. And here, there's 632 First Nations in the territories colonized as Canada, in addition to Inuit and Métis nations. And then in Palestine under the guardianship of Palestinians themselves. And you can see that underneath all of the narratives that are trying to quote unquote justify settler colonialism, we can see the truth in the land. So for me, I mentioned decolonial love, which sounds kind of jargony, so I thought people might want to know what I'm meaning when I say that. So grandmother Isabel Mawasake, who's one of my elders, she says our responsibility is to fix our broken medicine wheel. So for her, this is decolonization, to fix our broken medicine wheel by healing ourselves, our families, our communities, and nations. And her teachings inform my understanding of decolonization as a healing journey. And I also understand it as love of our individual and collective identities, despite the colonizers' hate. Love as connectedness with our land, love as enacting our collective freedom. And as I mentioned, I learned a lot about decolonial love when I was in Palestine from Palestinian women there. And for me, it's also part of our collective healing journey. and the foundation of those decolonial futurities of where we're trying to go and what we're co-creating today, in which Palestinians and Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island enact co-resistance, that we end settler colonialism, even though the colonial narrative is that we can't do that, that we protect the lands to which we belong, and seek collective liberation grounded in our identities, languages, ancestral and land-based knowledges, ethical relations, and traditions. And in the poetry of Mahmoud Darwish, for example, you can see that notion of belonging to the land. We and our land are one flesh, one bone, and Palestine is our mother. And for us, one of the ceremonies that we do with our umbilical cords is that we bury them in the territories that we belong to, so that we can always find our way home, that rootedness in the land. So that's a really important part of understanding decolonial love and decolonization. Some wisdom from Aisha, who also not her real name, but one of the young women I met when I was doing my research, also about decolonial love. Beside this poster of these beautiful siblings in Gaza, every word we say may change something. If we didn't have this belief that one word can change everything, then we wouldn't be here. There wouldn't be something called Palestine, or martyrs, or rocks thrown every day. We know that the rock doesn't change anything, but because we believe in it, it does. When we are convinced that we have a reason to live here, that we have the right because this is our country and our land and our life, when we get to that point, not one of us will ever give up. So these are just the names of the courses that I teach at King's for context. And the course from Turtle Island to Palestine, the last one on this list, that's taught with my elders, Mary Lou and Dan Smoke, and also in good relations with the Canada Palestine Social Association here in London, Independent Jewish Voices here in London, and People for Peace London, is what I'll talk about the most. So a really important part of teaching decolonization and enacting collective care from Turtle Island to Palestine is building, cultivating, sustaining good relations. And we always start class by creating a good relations wampum. So folks may be familiar with the practice of creating wampums, of creating treaties, of creating covenants between Indigenous nations here on Turtle Island, between Indigenous nations and settlers, and between Indigenous nations and the land. So the dish with one spoon wampum, people describe it as being between Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee, but it's also a wampum with our Earth Mother, with the land. And so we start there around what are the laws that are going to govern the way that we relate with one another and with community, and how will we address injustice and harm. We spend a lot of time enacting collective care. So in December 2022, there were a number of students and some of us faculty advocating for the university to be paying attention to financial precarity of students, food insecurity, where things are at post-COVID, systemic racism, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, sexual and gender-based violence. And we didn't get very far in the formal processes like College Council, for example. And so we came back together in class. It was actually the Decolonization 1 class, and talked about, you know, if we weren't going to get very far advocating in formal institutional mechanisms, how did we want to respond to that? And students decided that the response that is the most effective for us is mutual aid and collective care. And so we founded the Care Collective. It's a grassroots initiative started by students in that class. It's now, we now do Care Collective events under the umbrella of a number of classes here at King's. And therefore, the initiative is protected under academic freedom because it's part of our teaching. We also do Care Collective events with community. And so these are just some examples that are on the screen. We have elders teachings, we do healing circles, we do community kitchens. We did a decolonial love teach-in in November directly in response to anti-Palestinian hate, anti-Muslim hate that had been happening in the university. Actually, you can see a Palestinian flag behind me on the inside of my door, but there's also, I'm in my office, there's also one on the outside of my door. And twice, once I had a Palestinian banner and then a Palestinian flag. They were both vandalized with swastikas. I'm 2 doors down from the Muslim prayer room here in the basement. And so really concerned about Muslim students being in this hallway with that kind of hate crime happening. The university refused to take any kind of meaningful action. And so in addition to reporting the hate crime to the police, we also hosted a decolonial love teach-in where we made kind of like Valentine's and put them up in the Student Life Center with messages of love and solidarity for Palestinian, Muslim, and Arab community and all of our community. It was really beautiful until security came and took all of the Valentines down, because apparently even messages of love and solidarity are threatening in this climate. And so it hasn't prevented us from continuing to take action for collective care, but certainly we are needing to have those conversations with students when we do these initiatives that there may be suppression, there may be retribution. We don't know what the response will be. We need to be careful. You might want to opt out. You might not want to let people know that you're part of this. And so it's been a really tough set of conversations to have, holding both my responsibility to my own children, and so standing up every day, even when it's scary, because they deserve a future. And no one's job, no one's house, no one's car, no one's luxury, no one's comfort will ever be more important than their lives. And also knowing that students often are just learning about this and are in super precarious positions. And so they also are trying to navigate in a good way. And sometimes we'll say, you know what, like I need some time, I need some space. And so part of the collective care is also creating space for that. We also enact solidarity with community. So last March, we invited Eve Engler to come and speak. The university allowed the event to go forward, but made it very difficult. We did an event for the International Day of Solidarity with Palestinian People on November 9th at the London Muslim Mosque. It was really amazing. And we also were forbidden from advertising it inside the university. On February 24th, we're going to do a healing circle, Healing the Grief event in partnership with the Canada Palestine Social Association and the CARE Collective at Reimagine Co. Everyone is welcome. And so we're trying to also figure out, what does it mean to walk with community in a good way, and not think that we know better and not decide what it is that we're supposed to do, but really take that leadership from community, show up when we're asked to show up, walk in what community defines as a good way. Last Saturday, we also did a movie night. Leila Almawi showed her film Roman, and her uncle Zaki came and spoke. We had a community kitchen and cooked for manille, and it was beautiful as a healing space for community as well. Last year on Land Day, we also did an event with community. So that was part of Decolonization 2 course. During class time in the Student Life Center, we did a sharing circle with Elder Mary Lou Smoke. CPSA brought their apartheid wall, and then we did seed ball making, affirming belonging to the land. So we did seed ball making with Anis Haisop and with Common Yarrow, which are both traditional medicines to these territories, and we shared teachings about those medicines. And then community also did an event, which was not part of the course, but which some students chose to participate in the afternoon, a protest action at 2 major intersections not far from the university, raising awareness about land back from Turtle Island to Palestine and doing advocacy. Just a plug to ask folks to watch coming soon. We're doing a film festival from Turtle Island to Palestine, March 7th, 14th, 21st, and 28th. So March 7th will actually be a community event put on by Independent Jewish Voices and the Canada Palestine Social Association and People for Peace. London and the Care Collective will also partner. And then we will do show films here on the other 3 Thursdays in March. So in all of the classes, we do a collective action because decolonization is not sitting around reading books, it's making change. So this is our collective action this semester. Just briefly, because I think Rhonda and Jasmine and Cheryl have talked a lot about challenges, barriers, violence, and harms doing this work. But it has been an uphill battle in this space. And I did my job talk about my research in Palestine. I was very clear that that's what I was teaching about, so it wasn't a surprise at any point. Not that if it's a surprise, it's okay to be violent toward people. It is not, but also it was not a surprise. I was hired to teach decolonization, and it's still really been a challenge. The toughest thing I think has been that standing with Palestinian, Muslim, Arab, Indigenous, Black, racialized students is reframed by the colonial logic of the institution as insubordination, insurrection, incitement. And so there's this narrative and practice that it's dangerous to stand with students. And for me, I think that's the most destructive. It also then makes it suppresses students from also standing up. And so we had an incident last week where a Palestinian student was kicked out of an online class for having a flag up as her picture on her screen. And she filmed it, so there was evidence, and the response of the institution was to lecture her for 2 hours about filming her class, not to respond to the harm that she experienced through anti-Palestinian racism. And so we're trying to strategize around that and also additional incidents that have happened and figure out how to walk in a good way in this climate of repression and suppression. I think for me, it's always about addressing harm. It's always about the gifts that our ancestors gave us and the opportunity to be in this life at all. And the next 7 generations to come and our responsibilities to them. I just want to end by sharing a quote with you from a student from Decolonization 2, not the class that's running right now, but last year. And in response to the question, what do good relations with Indigenous and Palestinian community look and feel like? They said, being with communication and capacity building. Through communication comes community building. We build that space that is generative, safe. You could do a lot of organizing in that space. And shared learning. We have a shared recognition of struggles across structures of colonialism from Turtle Island to Palestine. Through this shared recognition, through identifying with the struggle, even though your lived experience may be different, your shared experience of struggle is the same. And we're working toward building communities of struggle. And Indigenous solidarity becomes an embodied practice around which these communities are built. We enact mutual aid to uplift one another as a community, to elevate everyone so they are and feel safe, through which we can learn and recognize each other and then take direct action and enact more tangible resistance together. Kina naskam mitnan, thank you.
Thank you, Jess. So now I think we're going to turn things over to David Heap, who will take us through our question and answer period.
Thanks very much, Shukran Chimikwech. Thanks to all our speakers and panelists. I have to begin by saying, however, that if this was in person, we would have been giving Jess a tobacco twist, as is appropriate for an honored guest of Indigenous background. So Jess, I owe them a tobacco twist when I see them next, Jess. There's a bunch of questions. We'll try to get through as many of them as the time allows, but as Josh says, there's a hard end to this webinar. So I will go to one which is addressed to all the panelists, so any of you can answer. As we know, and it's from Fatmi Abdallah, as we know, Robinson, ex-Minister Robinson from BC, Robinson was crucial in mandating Holocaust education in British Columbia, set to start in 2025. In order to promote, quote, neutrality, let alone nuance, we would need to accompany this with a history of settler colonization of Palestine. However, the reception of the education ministry to this request can only be guessed at. What are the panelists' thoughts on moving forward with this? And we can hear from any or all of you as you choose.
I'm happy to address that. It's uppermost in my mind right now as a coalition of Jewish, Palestinian, Muslim organizations and parents are demanding that the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center, which produces a lot of the Holocaust education, has been revealed as surveilling students and many other things. And keep your eyes peeled the next couple of weeks for a really incredible revelation about this. We're cooking it up as we speak. I think that one of the things that's really important, Holocaust education cannot be taught as an exceptional example of genocide. This is a battle that's going on in academia in many places, although that hasn't filtered down very well. But the fact that genocides, certainly in the 20th century and 19th century, have incredible interlinkages. And I mean, some of the Nazi technologies were honed on populations in Africa and in other places. And we have to understand that those things have influenced one another and remove the exceptionalism, because I think what happens in some of the Holocaust education modules is that the Holocaust is taught as an exceptional event without reference to these other colonial genocides. And I think that's very problematic in a lot of ways. So I think that's something that people need to get on their radar in terms of, I mean, the idea that Holocaust education is somehow the panacea for hate is something that does not have evidence for. There's no evidence for this in the empirical literature on Holocaust education, despite what they would have us believe. So I think that, if we have any demands at all in this area, they should be that these genocides have to be taught in connection to one another, and not only because that's actually the honest thing to do, but because the kids in these classes who are getting this education also bring to the classroom their own experiences of genocide and refugee status. And I imagine that listening to education on the Holocaust that paints it as exceptional must be a very painful experience for these kids. And I don't know how they're supposed to understand the lessons, the anti-hate lessons, if their experiences and their family histories are excluded. I could go on about this for a really long time. I will not. But I think there are lots of red flags that need to be raised here.
Thanks, Cheryl. Any of the other panelists want to jump in on that? Go ahead, please. Randa.
Yeah, just a quick note to add to Cheryl. Cheryl just clarified it really well. The response was excellent. I just want to add, and there's this idea that the Holocaust as exceptional and this monopoly of suffering. And if you talk about the Nakba, there is a subtext. It's almost like you're denying the Holocaust. If you talk about Palestinian suffering and, and I think this delinking of what happened in Europe and the accountability that should be clear that it has nothing, but it's almost like the image of the Nazi has been superimposed on the Palestinians and the Arabs as opposed to. So I think it's always clear to show that, European history is European history. And there's a completely different trajectory of the history of Jews in the Arab world. And I'm not idealizing it or romantic, but generally it has been a much more positive historical experience that should be brought to bear in our discussions.
Thank you, Randa. I'm sorry, I quickly scan here. I'm not seeing other hands. So we'll move on from an attendee who doesn't identify themselves. How does the International Court of Justice ruling impact these Canadian universities that have censored faculty and students because of criticism of Israel? Any of you? Okay, Rhonda, back to you.
Yeah, I don't have the full answer yet because I need to sort of reflect on it a bit more. But I know the ICJ came out with a ruling in, was it 2014 about the wall? The
2005, I think. It
is
was a
it
long time.
2005?
2005, yeah.
2005, July 2005, something like that.
2004, yeah.
And yeah, and they, you know, said that they were illegal and that the settlements were illegal, that it should be, you know, there was an order to bring it down and nothing happened. So it's almost like I think this time might be it might be more effective that South Africa, you know, which had experienced apartheid, has gone to the ICJ, even though I just heard that she's been threatened, the Minister of um, External Affairs, and she's been threatened. Her children were threatened because she supports the Palestinian right. So I don't know if, yeah, unless we sort of, you know, bring it to the surface and work on making it a big deal, like part of our mobilizational sort of discourse.
Great, thanks, Rhonda. Any of the other panelists?
Yes.
Jump in.
Sorry,
Thank you.
Jasmine, go ahead.
Go for it.
I just wanted to add as well that in addition to the ICJ ruling, and we may also, as Nicaragua rolls out sort of their action in the ICJ that is naming Canada, we may get more information about the impact of the ICJ on what is happening nationally or domestically. But it's not as if we don't have a whole legal framework in which people who are being censored at universities are already supposed to be protected. We have laws that are protecting freedom of speech. We have collective agreements that are protecting academic freedom. We have a whole human rights regime ostensibly here that is supposed to be protecting us against racism, against anti-Palestinian racism, anti-Muslim racism, anti-Indigenous racism. And so part of the context is not that we don't have a legal framework to protect us, but that the legal framework is willfully being ignored. And so I'm not sure that the ICJ itself making a ruling is going to enforce the legal rulings here to be following the actual law. I think we have other mechanisms, other advocacy mechanisms, other legal mechanisms here that are holding our legal systems to account more than the ICJ making a ruling. Not that it's not important, but I don't know that that's our primary tool.
Thank you. And sorry.
I'll just add
Jasmine.
quickly, I think, you know, I think that regardless of the what's been happening at the ICJ, I mean, prior to this, the censorship of faculty and students should never have been happening to begin with. But what we can say about the current context is that I think, you know, the sands are shifting somewhat. The tide is turning in terms of, you know, the pro-Israel groups and that are kind of losing ground and are losing the argument in a lot of ways in light of new evidence, in light of what is being publicly shared now about what's happening in Palestine. And we see even a lot of the targeting that we've been talking about. Many of us have known this for many years, but people are now just starting to realize, because it's not just happening in academia, it's happening in other sectors, in medicine and in law and other places. So it's become quite now apparent, you know, what's going on. And I think that with that knowledge, it is a good time to start to pressure our university administration into taking stronger stands and making statements that they essentially should have done a long time ago. So if anything, I think that this provides another way to pressure the universities to take a stronger stand than, you know, what they have in the past.
I don't know, I would like actually to ask a question myself, but to what extent are these institutions beholden to funders? And to what extent will they be free to loosen themselves from that influence? I mean, of course, we need to pressure them more and these institutions, but I just see this like relationship, power relationship with a lot of dollars being waved, especially in this neoliberal environment. I don't know.
Anyone else? Okay. I love it when panels, first of all, I need to say there's more questions in the Q&A than we're going to be able to get to, so I apologize in advance if we don't get to your question. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible. I love it when panels about teaching actually ask for teaching tips. So from Judy Rebick, thanks for joining us, Judy. I teach a course at TMU on social movements. This year, I had 2 Zionist students in my class who asked that they invite a speaker who represented their views. I wanted to teach about pro-Palestinian movements because I believe it's the most important movement we have seen in decades, but it was difficult to present when the differences in the class were so emotional. Do you have any suggestions?
I'll just give a little bit of advice. I always say that I taught at OISE for 12 years, and you can't scare me. You OISE graduates will understand what I'm talking about. I think that one of the things when you have these very emotionally fraught issues, in some ways you have to, I found that you have to deflect attention away from, the people who advocate on either side of those issues. And you have to focus on text. Like focusing on text, like people can have arguments about what the text says without without personal attacks on people's necessarily on people's opinions. And I think just keeping it there, it's like, because one of the things I say to students, we don't share anything. For the most part, we don't, we're not involved with each other. We don't know how to treat each other, as friends yet. We can develop that. But the only thing, all we have is the text. That's all we have to actually engage with each other. And I think that just, focusing on that can be helpful. It was helpful for me in my teaching life.
David?
Thanks, Cheryl. Anyone else? Sorry.
Yeah.
Randa, please jump in.
Yeah. I don't know if this will be any help, but that might actually be unhelpful. I remember I had the daughter of a general in the Israeli army one time in my class. And because they have, dual citizenship and they were living here or something. He wrote to me when, she started taking the text back home and talking about the Nakba. And so he wrote to me an email telling me that when the exam comes, she's going to write whatever she wants about 1948, what she believes was the right history of 1948. And because according to him, Israel was a good thing for the Palestinians. They, made the economy flourish and so on. So in that particular case, I chose to ignore it because sometimes if you engage, that's what they want to engage, and then you get so frustrated, and I was okay by ignoring it, but the thing is, when I teach about Palestinian refugees, for example, I tell them this is not about Israeli society. This is about the effects of Israel on the Palestinians. It's like you are talking about Israel, but you're talking about it as a colonial, like you are showing the two sides of the coin. You are telling them that Israel occupied the Palestinians, and this is what happened to the Palestinians as a result. I'm not going to go into the politics of Israel and the history of Zionism, but the effects of Zionism on the Palestinian society. So that's legitimate. I don't have to I used to, because I used to be so intimidated, have these Zionists come and give their own presentations to counter my narrative. It's a way to invalidate your authority as well. And they would come, for example, show a map of the region and Palestine and Israel as a small David, and look at all these Arab countries, barbarians surrounding Israel, and or that again that a presentation on Israeli their struggle to not just how they made the desert bloom and how green it was, and so we just have to stand up to that, say, if you want something about Israeli society, take another course. I mean, we have to get to that point, because it's like intimidation, constant intimidation about what we're saying, what we're doing. The same thing does not happen with many other cases. It's only when it comes to the Palestinian issue, because it's a settler colonial situation, and they're trying to legitimate their powerful narrative that circulates in Western societies. Like we're almost like, yeah.
Thank you.
David?
Sorry, I can't see all the speakers here.
Sorry,
Yes, go ahead. Yeah,
it's
just jump in.
I don't know that I'm qualified to give Judy Rebick advice, but I will try. Something that we have had some luck with here is working with elders who feel confident to speak about Palestine as well as the settler colonialism here on Turtle Island. So we have held some healing circles. We have had elders come and speak, and it shifts the air. It shifts the space for conversation often. In my experience, it also often shifts people's behavior and what they're willing to do in relation to an elder compared to other students. So it's a suggestion. If you don't have elders at TMU who are comfortable facilitating the conversation, I'm also happy to share the names of some of my elders who are. And your question about the map, about where you can access the map of Canada with Indigenous land map out on it, it comes from sorry, I'm going to flip the letters. Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, CJPME. I think that's the right order of the letters. So it's from their work that map is available.
I'll just weigh in a bit as well in terms of the question about, when people want to hear the other side of the story. If this was a course on white settler colonialism in Canada and Indigenous experiences, you wouldn't be inviting a speaker to take the pro-colonial, side of this. Or if it was about Black Lives Matter as a social movement, you're not going to have white nationalists come in and give the other side. So I think that this idea that there needs to be, representation of all the arguments isn't something that we should necessarily entertain. I know I've had this happen on some panels that I've been invited to on topics like this, where there was pushback in one of the institutions by donors and others to say that, okay, if you're doing this panel, you need to have a pro-Zionist voice. And one of the speakers was also on the panel, is Palestinian and lost 74 members of her family in Gaza. And she's like, absolutely, I am not going to be sitting on this panel and entertaining, someone who is going to be speaking from a perspective to justify what's happening. So I don't think we need to to entertain those particular requests, and we can simply reframe them in the way that I've said, so that hopefully people would understand why it wouldn't be appropriate to do that.
Is there time for me to add one thing, David, quickly?
Go for it, Randa. Yes,
yeah,
please.
Thank you. I think it has to do with this history of framing the whole thing as a conflict previously. And when you say a conflict, you're talking about two equal sides, as if, there is this and that, so you need to listen to both views. And that was a way to camouflage the settler colonial. But now I remember talking about it as a conflict. I had internalized that kind of language at one point. And so it's good to sort of reframe it as it is. It is a settler colony. And when you do that, then everything that we said about, we don't have to bring an Afrikaner or a colonial settler to explain their point of view. It becomes the same, it's in the same kind of frame.
Thank you. And now I'll exercise the moderator's discretion, and just note that we've got a vanishing amount of time and far too many questions. Some lovely comments which I will answer so that people can see the answers when they're answered. So look in the answered column. There's more there now than in the open questions column. But a double question from Galahindi Ninham. What can and should everyday citizens do to show support and normalize acceptance of peoples over the current colonial mindsets? And also from Galahindi, when applying, quote, pressure to academic institutions, what does that look like and how is it done? Yonko for the question, Galahindi. Anybody want to jump in on either of those?
I'll just say something about the question around applying pressure to our academic institutions. So, in October, when statements came out from universities about what was happening, and I think there was a case where university presidents were called in, at least in Ontario, to have a meeting with the Minister of Colleges and Universities, and were briefed, and then certain messaging went out And I noticed at our university, there was messaging that talked about the pro-Palestine rallies as kind of glorifications of violence. I mentioned this in my talk, and that language was reproduced not only by, Justin Trudeau, or here in Toronto by Mayor Olivia Chow in reference to that. Now you have universities who are saying, well, we condemn glorifications of violence. And so I wrote a letter to the university president and administration, talking about why that was an Islamophobic trope that has been long used to connect, Muslims, Palestinians, with notions of terrorism and celebrating violence and all of this sort of, issue, and requested that it be removed because it is reinforcing a longstanding Islamophobic trope. And they did remove it. And so I think that we need to, be able to, and I had other colleagues sign that letter and we sent it out. And I'm not saying this is going to work in every instance. Every university is different and the politics are different and the stakes are different, but we have to be able to work in solidarity with our colleagues, in our institutions who are willing to be involved in that sort of pushback and be able to support. Because we can't do this on our own. We do need to make sure that we have our unions behind us, that we have colleagues behind us, and start to send those letters and those the arguments that we want to make to the university. And so that's what I would suggest is, making sure that we're attentive to what's the messaging being put out and challenging things that are problematic and having our supporters, endorse that intervention.
And I would like to just add also making it visible, making what happens visible. So when the swastikas were drawn on my door, the #1 goal of the university was to suppress the information. So a colleague who's the chair of the religious studies department, Chaya Halberstam, whose office is right next to mine, who also is in this hallway, who also experienced that swastika being put, we took a motion to college council that named what happened, that asked the university to name the incidents of the hate crimes for the whole campus, and to enact a collective safety strategy in consultation with all communities that would be impacted by a swastika. The response of the university was, of course, to make the agenda so long that we didn't get to the resolution. So next Wednesday, College Council, King's University College, 2:30 p.m., Kenny Theater, open to the public. You can't speak, but you can be there. Feel free to come. The motion's coming back on the floor. And we are not allowing the incidents of violence and harm and hate that happen to be hidden, because divide, conquer, silence, fear is their strategy, and everything that we do needs to be countering that.
Thank you. Other panelists, sorry. We're good? Okay. From Erica Mearshad. Do you think part of our current problem is that we haven't been alert and public enough about fighting anti-Semitism? If we had, then it wouldn't be so easy to use anti-Semitism as a label where it doesn't belong. And there would be less of the defensiveness around perceived attacks on Jews. Or is this simply a red herring?
Okay, I can try this one. I'm going to confess that I do think that anti-Semitism is a neglected topic in EDI work and even in critical scholarship to some degree. I did my part when I was teaching to bring forward the incredible treasure trove of critical Jewish scholarship that exists. But I think that one of the things that's happened is that pro-Israel advocates and people who are using anti-Semitism as a weapon have made enormous efforts to be the definers of anti-Semitism. There's a huge pushback against that. I don't want to get into all the details, but I think that there needs to be consideration given to people who are critical of the weaponization of anti-Semitism, to be able to bring that perspective onto campuses, to the EDI people, to the deans, and all the people who are being pressured by the Israel lobby and the people who are weaponizing anti-Semitism to adopt, the perspective that strong criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. That needs to be countered absolutely. And one of the things we're fighting now is the free reign that some of these organizations, as I mentioned, Simon Wiesenthal, but also CIJA and B'nai B'rith, the kind of moral high ground that they claim in terms of being able to define and fight anti-Semitism, is actually underlain by an attempt to quash criticism of Israel. I think it's a really complicated topic. I think that the discourses of Jews and whiteness, which aren't well understood or looked at in very complex ways, need to be unpacked. I think there just needs to be a much more sophisticated approach to countering anti-Semitism. I think it would help in the accusations and the lawsuits that are flying around to have actually engaged with anti-Semitism in a really critical and constructive way. And I certainly would like to see that happening. It's anybody's guess whether it could help against the allegations, but there are more and more voices coming out to say this weaponization is destructive to Jews and to Palestinians and to people who are pro-Palestine. So, that's kind of, I would have a lot more to say about that, but I'll just leave it there.
Randa.
Yes, I was under the impression that anti-Semitism was part of the EDID, and I know that like the school boards, like they actually mention, we're going to oppose anti-Semitism and, all kinds of other, anti-phobia and racism and so on. I just wonder, I think that's important. If it's not, I think it should be included in the EDIDs, all of the, and the conversation about it and how it's different. But I think equally we should include anti-Palestinian racism. We don't even have a conversation about it and how it should be included as part of these equity, diversity, inclusion committees. So I think that would be really an important kind of step to make sure that there's a clear definition and we can use Cheryl's work and the IGB work because they have been so critical in raising awareness around these issues. Actually, I rely on them a lot and I use their names and, in classes but also anti-Palestinian racism is still like in the beginning, it's this fuzzy thing. And so I imagine it might be really helpful if we can have conversations about both maybe together to show that, being anti-Semitic doesn't mean, you're a Palestinian, you're a terrorist and I mean, fighting anti-Semitism and fighting Palestinian racism can be together, can go hand in hand.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, this might be our last question. It depends on the answers. From Aida Koshandi, do you know of resources for Palestine teachings in classrooms, especially cultural practices, music, etc.? Thank you for such a great session. Sorry, say again?
Sorry, David, I missed the question. What was
question? Ida is asking about resources for Palestine teachings in classrooms, especially cultural practices, music, etc. Thank you for such a great session.
Yes, I mean, I can send you at some point like a list of sources, and I don't know if she can contact you, David, or how does that, or she can contact directly.
Me through Public Humanities or Renda for her, her link was shared earlier, or
I'll
Public
put
Humanities at
my
Western.
I put my email here.
Okay. And I'm apologizing that we won't get to all the questions. Does anybody else? There's Renda's. Okay, I'll just take one more. See, how do those of us without academic freedom, many academic staff, for example, or tenure, be effective allies and co-conspirators in our institutions and advocate for our freedom of expression on anti-Palestinian racism and genocide? Anyone?
So one of the things that's happened here at King's is that we've been able to sort of work across spaces and employment categories. So when we did the decolonial love teach-in and we put up the messages of love and solidarity on hearts in the Student Life Center, and security came to take them down, the folks at the Writing Center insisted that at least some of them be up permanently in the Writing Center. And so, for example, we've had some ways where folks are able to sort of stand with one another. We also, because we have the Care Collective as an initiative, and we also have a decolonization advisory circle here at King's as an initiative that's across faculty and staff, and of course the Care Collective also with students. And so there's ways to act in the collective and be together, but not be out in front. Yani, not have your face out in front of everyone, but still be part of doing initiatives together. And I'm sure in every space there's tons of ways to do that, but that has seemed to be the most effective, is not to put people in precarious positions, in more precarious positions, but to be for the people who are more protected to be the ones out in front.
Other thoughts?
I mean, another tip is to partner with the radical Jewish organizations. We, one of the things we like to do is give cover, right, and defend people, and to demonstrate that it is not anti-Semitic what people are doing. So always feel that you can reach out to independent Jewish voices. In the wake of October 7th, there's been 1,000 flowers have bloomed. There's the there's the Jews Against Genocide Collective. There are many other groups working out there right now. So I encourage you. The other thing I was thinking is that if people are unionized, they need to go to their unions for support. I mean, so many of the unions have come out in support of Palestine and are defending their members and their leadership, against these accusations. So I think it's really important to coordinate with your union reps and find out what your rights are in the workplace in terms of expression.
Thanks. It's right on the hour. We do have hard end, don't we? So for those of you asking about the recording of the panel, you can write to Public Humanities at Western, and after we check with the panelists, the recording will be available. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the other questions and responses, but we responded to 43 of them and only left 11. So there's lots going on here. Do we have a final word from one of my colleagues? I'll just thank you all for coming. Yeah.
Go ahead, David, please. I would like to thank everybody for this amazing talk, but I'll give you the last word, David.
I'm just grateful to all of our panelists, but also to Erica and my other colleagues on this committee for pulling together this lovely event and for making time for it. Because as we discovered when we tried to make a pre-panel meeting, it's impossible to get these busy scholars at the same time. So we're just truly blessed and lucky that these 2 hours were available for all 4 of these people. And thanks to the almost 200 people, I think, Josh, that joined us. And thanks to Josh Lambie for his very talented handling of the whole webinar machinery, made it run smoothly for everyone.
And in turn, thank you, David, Josh, Erica, of course, Jeff, everyone. That was Julie. That was really Julia. That was really amazing. We are grateful. Thank you.
Yes, kinanas komitnan.
Bye from me.
Good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are.
Siguli Swagwag, Galahindini Agats again. Want to thank everyone who popped in, and I hope that you found this event eye-opening. It's kind of, for me, a little difficult to comprehend that this kind of thing is still going on these days, and it's just kind of so bizarre. But that being said, it is something that has to be continued. we always have to have these difficult conversations for all marginalized communities that are going through such traumatic events. And right now, um, Palestine needs all the support that they can get from every angle that they can get it from. And because the genocide that's happening over there is just it's it's un, it's unbelievable. But we have to keep on having these conversations. And so I'm glad that David Heap moderated this. So I'll have to thank him for the event in person when I see him next. And Jess Notwell is an awesome person as well. And we've been to events um, that she has organized for the indigenous communities here as well. So a great person to have as a resource. And maybe at some point we can bring Jess on stream and have a chat with her here directly. In the meantime, I'm going to look out for someone to raid. I'm going to ask if you could all just stick around long enough to come over and say hello to whoever we raid into. So as I always do, is I'll end the stream with a rendition of the Peaceful Warrior, and so I will. Let's see, who have we not heard from for a while? Huh. See if I can do this here. I'm going to actually show or play a rendition of the Peaceful Warrior that there's no video from, but it actually was a studio recording from one of our friends named Sherry Smith Music. So while I'm playing this, again, I'll put the raid call in. And this is actually going to be the first time I played this rendition on stream because this is a version that she actually recorded in studio and has released on Spotify and Bandcamp. Pretty cool that my song's been put out there, or my poem's been put out there as a song. So let me get my mug off the screen again, and we'll play Sherry Smith, the Peaceful Warrior, and then we'll get ready to raid somebody. And so copy a raid call when I put it in the chat, and then once you copy the raid call, refresh your chat so that you're counted properly when we go over to the next streamer. And so let's hear this from Sherry Smith.
My name is Sherry, I'm at war for equity and peace. All these census attacks I see must harm the system cease. So what I'm doing here, what I really want to say, the world has got to change its unforgiving ways, oh yeah. My. I'm talking about all of the people from the oceans to the skies. I'm talking about all of the issues from the truth to all the lies. I'm gonna make my stand with a paper and pen. If you wanna argue with that, go back to bed again. So let's keep passing around our knowledge and information, so we can improve this planet through truth and education. Somebody's gotta make the people aware. Somebody's gotta make everybody care. So pass on my message if you dare. My name is Sherry, I'm at war for equity and peace. All those census attacks I see must hope the system sees. I'm gonna battle for the red, white, yellow, and black. I'm gonna fight for the ones who can't fight back. Fight for the women with no rights to their bodies. Fight for the people for whom nobody lobbies. Fight for the people who fear just being themselves. Fight for the earth upon which we all dwell. There's more power in one man's voice than all of the weapons of military choice. So with my voice and yours we can shout out loud. We belong to the human race and we are proud. You don't have to be a master of science to see we need a worldwide alliance. We've seen how the world can be devastated through actions of men with minds of hatred. Oh yeah, my mind. My name is Sherry, I'm at war for equity and peace. All those census attacks I see must hope the system sees. So what I'm doing here, what I really want to say, the world has got to change its unforgiving ways. I won't be able to move this world all alone. So please help me